April 10, 1945, Boston, Massachusetts. Margaret Sullivan stared at the telegram in her trembling hands, the crisp paper edges cutting into her skin as rain pattered against the kitchen window, each drop another second ticking by in her suddenly shattered world. The words blurred before her eyes. "We regret to inform you that your husband, Lieutenant Thomas Sullivan, has been reported missing in action in the Pacific Theater." Margaret was certain as the spring rain outside her window, that this cold, impersonal piece of paper marked the end of her life with Thomas. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What Margaret could not possibly know on that rainy April morning was that fate had orchestrated an extraordinary series of events that would challenge everything she believed about separation, survival, and the unexpected ways technology could bridge impossible distances during the final days of the greatest conflict in human history. The morning had begun like any other Tuesday, since Thomas had shipped out 18 months earlier. Margaret rose at 6, dressed in her work clothes, and prepared for her shift at the Charlestown Navy Yard, where she worked as a clerical assistant in the supply department. At 32 years old, Margaret had transformed from a homemaker into one of the millions of American women who answered their country's call, while their husbands, brothers, and sons fought overseas. "Coffee's getting cold, Mags," called Eleanor Winters from the hallway. Eleanor, a widow from the first floor, had become Margaret's close friend and carpooling companion since both women had started working at the yard in 1943. "Coming?" Margaret replied, tucking a photo of Thomas back into her handbag. It had been taken the day before he shipped out. Thomas, in his crisp naval lieutenant's uniform, his dark hair neatly combed, his smile confident despite the uncertainty that lay ahead. As they drove through the morning drizzle, Eleanor chatted about rationing and her son's latest letter from Italy, but Margaret found herself distracted by a strange sense of foreboding that had followed her from a troubled night's sleep. "You're awfully quiet this morning," Eleanor observed as they passed through the security checkpoint at the yard. Margaret forced a smile. "Just tired. I was up late listening to the radio reports about the fighting in the Pacific." Eleanor nodded sympathetically. "They say it's getting worse out there. Those islands are costing so many lives." It wasn't until 4 hours later, sorting through procurement forms for medical supplies, that Margaret was summoned to the administration office. The sight of the Western Union messenger standing beside her supervisor's desk made her blood run cold. Now, sitting at her kitchen table with the telegram before her, Margaret felt the world collapse inward. Thomas had been serving aboard the destroyer USS Colquhoun, patrolling the waters near Okinawa. According to the sparse details in the telegram, the ship had encountered enemy aircraft 3 days earlier. That was all the information provided. No confirmation of survivors, no bodies recovered, just the cold bureaucratic designation. Missing in action. "You need to eat something, dear," Eleanor said softly, placing a cup of tea and some toast before Margaret. She had insisted on driving Margaret home and staying with her after the telegram arrived. "How can I eat?" Margaret whispered. "How can I do anything?" "Because that's what we do," Eleanor replied, with the wisdom of someone who had received her own telegram 3 years earlier, when her husband's merchant vessel was torpedoed in the Atlantic. "We keep going. And missing isn't the same as confirmed lost. There's still hope." But hope felt like a luxury Margaret couldn't afford. Thomas was a communications officer, responsible for the ship's radio operations. If anyone could have sent a distress signal, it would have been him. The silence spoke volumes. Across the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, 2,000 miles west of Boston, Lieutenant Thomas Sullivan drifted in and out of consciousness, aboard a makeshift raft cobbled together from debris of the USS Colquhoun. His lips were cracked from dehydration, his fair skin blistered by the relentless sun, and his left leg bore an ugly gash from flying shrapnel. "Water," he croaked to no one. The 3 men who had initially shared his raft had succumbed one by one to their injuries over the past 72 hours. Now Thomas was alone, adrift in an endless blue expanse that stretched in every direction. The Colquhoun had been providing radar picket duty off Okinawa when the attack came. Not the expected conventional bomber formation, but a wave of aircraft deliberately crashing into Allied vessels. Thomas had been in the communications room when the first impact rocked the ship, throwing him against the radio equipment. In the chaos that followed, he managed to send a partial distress signal before the order came to abandon ship. Now delirious from the sun and lack of water, Thomas found himself conversing with phantoms of his mind. His father, long dead, his academy classmates, and most frequently Margaret. "Remember our cottage at Lake Winnipesaukee?" he murmured to the hallucination of his wife that shimmered above the raft. "We'll go back there when this is over. Watch the sunrise from the dock like we used to." In his more lucid moments, Thomas knew his chances of survival were diminishing by the hour. The naval conflict around Okinawa was too intense, the area too vast for rescue operations to find every survivor. He had managed to salvage his service pistol and a small emergency kit from the ship, but with no fresh water his time was limited. On what he estimated was his fourth day adrift, Thomas's world changed with the distant drone of an aircraft engine. Struggling to sit upright, he fumbled for the small signal mirror in the emergency kit. With trembling hands, he angled it toward the approaching silhouette, desperate to catch the sun's rays. The PBY Catalina flying boat belonged to Squadron VPB-23, conducting routine search and rescue operations. Lieutenant Commander James Donovan was about to complete his patrol pattern when his co-pilot spotted the flash. 2 o'clock, about 3 miles out, called Lieutenant Robert Chen, pointing toward the glint of light on the ocean's surface. Donovan banked the aircraft gently. "Let's take a look." As the flying boat descended for a closer inspection, the crew spotted the makeshift raft and a single figure weakly waving what appeared to be a piece of cloth. "Survivor in the water," radioed Chen to their base at Karama Reto, a small island group that the Americans had secured as a naval anchorage near Okinawa. "Appears to be from a downed vessel, initiating water landing and recovery." The rescue was recorded in the squadron's log with clinical efficiency. 1400 hours, April 13th. Recovered 1 survivor, identified as Lieutenant Thomas Sullivan, Communications Officer, USS Colquhoun. Subject suffering from dehydration, exposure, and leg wound. Transported to Field Hospital, Karama Reto. Back in Boston, Margaret Sullivan moved through the following days in a fog of grief. She continued going to work, finding that the routine provided some small comfort. Her supervisor, Commander William Hayes, had served with Thomas at the Naval Academy and made special arrangements for Margaret to receive any updates as soon as they became available. "The Pacific is a big place, Mrs. Sullivan," Hayes explained gently when Margaret visited his office seeking more information, "and communications can be delayed by operational security. Don't lose faith yet." On April 17th, exactly 1 week after receiving the telegram, Margaret was sorting through Thomas's personal effects, not to pack them away, but to touch the things he had touched, to feel some connection to him. Among his possessions was the amateur radio set he had built before joining the Navy, his pride and joy that now sat silent in the corner of their spare room. Thomas had been passionate about radio communication since his teenage years, constructing increasingly sophisticated equipment that connected him to enthusiasts around the world. He had taught Margaret the basics, though she had never shared his technical fascination with the medium. Running her fingers over the dials, Margaret remembered the evenings they had spent in this room, Thomas patiently explaining frequencies and call signs while she pretended to understand, more interested in the enthusiasm lighting up his face than in the technical details. On impulse, she switched on the set, adjusting the dials as Thomas had shown her. Static filled the room, a sound that had once irritated her, but now felt like a tenuous connection to her missing husband. Meanwhile, in the field hospital on Karama Reto, Thomas Sullivan was recovering slowly. His leg wound had become infected, requiring aggressive treatment with the newly available penicillin. Weak but stable, he found himself sharing a medical tent with 24 other injured servicemen, a mix of Navy personnel, Marines, and Army soldiers, all casualties of the Okinawa campaign. "You're one lucky son of a gun, Lieutenant," remarked Navy Dr. Marshall Freeman during morning rounds. "Another day on that raft and we wouldn't be having this conversation." Thomas managed a weak smile. "Any word on other survivors from the Colquhoun?" Freeman's expression sobered. "Some, yes, your ship took heavy damage. I'm afraid the losses were significant." Thomas nodded, processing this information. I need to contact my wife in Boston. She must think I'm all in good time, Freeman interrupted. The communications situation is complicated right now. Once you're stabilized, we'll arrange for you to send a message home. What Dr. Freeman didn't fully explain was that the chaotic situation around Okinawa had created a massive backlog in non-essential communications. Priority was given to operational messages, with personal communications from servicemen to their families delayed indefinitely. In the bed next to Thomas was Marine Corps radio operator Sergeant Daniel Morales, recovering from shrapnel wounds received during the initial landings on Okinawa. "Heard you were a radio man on your ship," Morales said. After Freeman had moved on to the next patient, Thomas turned toward the Marine. "Communications officer, yes." Morales glanced around conspiratorially before lowering his voice. "Look, I might be able to help with your situation. There's an amateur radio set that some of the communications guys rigged up in one of the supply tents. It's not exactly regulation, but the brass turns a blind eye because it helps with morale." "You're suggesting I try to reach Boston on an amateur radio?" Thomas asked incredulously. "That's thousands of miles." Morales shrugged. "Under normal conditions, no way. But the atmospheric conditions have been unusual lately, something to do with solar activity. Some of the guys have made contact with operators on the West Coast. If your wife knows how to operate a set—" "She has basic knowledge," Thomas replied, hope stirring for the first time. "But even if we could establish contact, the chances of her being at the radio at the exact right moment—" "True," Morales conceded, "but what other options do you have?" The more Thomas considered the idea, the more it appealed to him. Not just the slim chance of reaching Margaret directly, but the comfort of returning to a familiar activity, of doing something proactive rather than lying in a hospital bed awaiting bureaucratic processes. "How soon can you get me to this radio?" Thomas asked. Morales grinned. "Let me work on it. Might take a day or two to arrange transportation and a quiet time when the tent's empty." In Boston, Margaret had begun a nightly ritual of sitting at Thomas's radio for an hour, scanning frequencies and listening to the distant voices and Morse code that filtered through the static. She had no real expectation of hearing anything significant. It was simply a way of feeling close to Thomas, of engaging with something he had loved. On the evening of April 20th, Eleanor visited with a casserole and found Margaret at the radio. "What are you doing, dear?" she asked, setting the food down on a side table. Margaret gestured to the equipment. "Just listening. It makes me feel like he's not completely gone." Eleanor studied her friend with concern. "Have you thought about what Commander Hayes said? About arranging for you to stay with your sister in Vermont for a while?" "I'm not leaving this house, Eleanor," Margaret replied firmly. "Not while there's even the slightest chance." Eleanor sat beside her, taking her hand. "I understand, believe me. When Frank was lost, I kept his pipe tobacco in the house for months. Couldn't bear to throw it away even though I hated the smell." "Does it ever get easier?" Margaret asked quietly. "Not easier," Eleanor replied thoughtfully. "Different. The sharp edges of grief eventually wear down, but the empty space never quite fills up." Their conversation was interrupted by a surge of static from the radio, followed by a voice breaking through the noise, fragmented but audible. "Calling Eastern Seaboard. Karama Reto to Eastern Seaboard. Any operators?" Margaret leaned forward, adjusting the tuning dial slightly to improve the reception. "That's coming from the Pacific," she said, her heartbeat quickening. "Someone's broadcasting from near Okinawa." Eleanor looked skeptical. "Can they transmit that far? I thought these amateur sets were limited." Thomas always said that under the right atmospheric conditions, signals could travel incredible distances, Margaret explained, her fingers working the controls as Thomas had taught her. He called them skip signals, something about the ionosphere reflecting the radio waves. The voice came through again, stronger this time. "This is KR Portable, broadcasting from Karama Reto in the Pacific. Any Eastern Seaboard operators receiving, please respond." With trembling hands, Margaret activated the microphone. "This is W1ABS in Boston receiving you, KR Portable. You're coming through broken but readable." There was a long pause filled with static, and Margaret feared the connection had been lost. Then the voice returned. Boston, this is Lieutenant Thomas Sullivan, United States Navy. I'm trying to reach Margaret Sullivan at 48 Marlborough Street. The microphone slipped from Margaret's hand, clattering onto the desk. Eleanor gasped, her eyes widening as she stared at the radio in disbelief. "It can't be," Margaret whispered, her voice failing her. Eleanor recovered first, snatching up the microphone and pressing it into Margaret's hand. "Answer him," she urged. Margaret drew a shaky breath. This is Margaret Sullivan," she managed, her voice barely audible. "Who is this really? This isn't funny." The response came through a wash of static. "Maggie, it's me. I know this seems impossible. I was rescued from the Colquhoun 4 days after the attack. I'm in a field hospital." "Thomas!" Margaret's voice broke on his name. "Is it really you? They told me you were missing, presumed." "I know, sweetheart. Communications are backlogged. I couldn't wait for official channels to tell you I was alive." Tears streamed down Margaret's face as Eleanor wrapped an arm around her shoulders for support. "Where are you exactly?" Margaret asked, trying to make sense of this miracle. "Are you hurt?" "I'm on a small island near Okinawa. Got banged up a bit, but I'm recovering." "Listen, the signal might not hold, so I need to tell you—" The transmission dissolved into unintelligible noise, the connection fading as quickly as it had appeared. "Thomas," Margaret called desperately, adjusting the dials. "Thomas, are you there?" But only static answered her. Eleanor was already reaching for the telephone. "We need to call Commander Hayes right away. If Thomas is alive, the Navy needs to know where he is." The next morning found Margaret and Commander Hayes in his office at the Navy Yard, waiting for a long-distance telephone connection to Pacific Fleet headquarters in Pearl Harbor. "I still can't quite believe it," Hayes said, shaking his head in amazement. "The odds of him establishing radio contact directly with you." "Thomas always said amateur radio was magical," Margaret replied, a newfound energy animating her voice and movements. "Now I understand why." The telephone on Hayes's desk rang, and he quickly answered. "Commander William Hayes speaking." "Yes, I'll hold for Captain Reynolds." Margaret listened anxiously as Hayes explained the situation, providing Thomas's service number and the information about his location at Karama Retto Field Hospital. The conversation lasted several minutes, with Hayes mostly listening and occasionally saying, "Yes, sir," or "I understand." Finally, he hung up and turned to Margaret with a smile. "They've confirmed it. Lieutenant Thomas Sullivan is indeed at the field hospital on Karama Retto, recovering from injuries sustained when the USS Colquhoun was attacked." Margaret covered her face with her hands, overcome with emotion. "He's really alive," she whispered through her fingers. "Very much so," Hayes confirmed. "Apparently there was quite a mix-up. His name was on the initial missing list, but when he was rescued, the update didn't make it through the communication channels properly. The official notification of his rescue is probably still working its way through the system." "How soon will they bring him home?" Margaret asked, already calculating days and weeks in her mind. Hayes's expression grew more measured. "That's more complicated. He's not critical enough for immediate medical evacuation, and the situation around Okinawa remains intense. Captain Reynolds estimates it might be 1 to 2 months before he can be transported back to the States." 2 months, Margaret repeated, her initial elation tempered by this news. Still, compared to the lifetime of absence she had been preparing herself for, 2 months felt manageable. "There's one more thing," Hayes added. "Using that amateur radio was technically against regulations. Thomas won't face any serious consequences. Given the circumstances, the brass is willing to overlook it, but he's been instructed not to attempt further unofficial communications. So I won't hear from him again until he comes home," Margaret said, disappointment evident in her voice. "I'm afraid not. At least not directly. But now that we know where he is, you'll receive official updates on his condition regularly." As Margaret left the Navy Yard that afternoon, the world around her seemed transformed. The same streets she had walked in despair just days before now felt full of promise. The cherry trees along Commonwealth Avenue were beginning to bloom, their pink blossoms catching the spring sunlight. For the first time since receiving the telegram, Margaret noticed the beauty around her. Eleanor was waiting at Margaret's house, eager for news. When Margaret related what Commander Hayes had told her, Eleanor hugged her tightly. "It's a miracle, Mags. A genuine miracle," she said, wiping away tears. "In all my years, I've never heard of anything like it." That evening, Margaret returned to Thomas's radio room. Though she knew she wouldn't hear his voice again through this equipment, sitting among his belongings brought her comfort. She picked up the framed photograph on the desk, their wedding day, 7 years earlier. Thomas handsome in his civilian suit, before the war had called him to service. 2 more months, she whispered to his image. "We can manage that." On Karama Reto, Thomas Sullivan was facing disciplinary action for his unauthorized use of the amateur radio equipment. Standing before the hospital's commanding officer, Captain Howard Jennings, he maintained a respectful posture, despite the pain in his injured leg. "Lieutenant, I understand your motivation," Jennings said, his tone stern but not unkind. "But regulations exist for a reason. Unsecured communications from a forward operating area could compromise operational security." "I understand, sir," Thomas replied. "I accept full responsibility." Jennings studied him for a moment. "Fortunately for you, your transmission contained no strategic information, and your wife had the good sense to contact proper authorities immediately. Under the circumstances, I'm limiting your punishment to a formal reprimand in your service record." "Thank you, sir. However," Jennings continued, "I'm afraid your recovery will have to continue here for the foreseeable future. The medical evacuation flights are reserved for critical cases, and the hospital ships are operating at capacity." Thomas nodded, unsurprised by this news. "I understand, sir. May I ask if my wife has been officially notified of my status?" "Commander Hayes in Boston has confirmed that Mrs. Sullivan has been informed of your survival and condition," Jennings assured him. "You'll be permitted to send her a letter via the next available transport plane." As Thomas made his way back to his hospital bed, leaning heavily on crutches, he was greeted by Sergeant Morales. "So how bad was it?" the Marine asked. "Could have been worse," Thomas replied, easing himself onto the bed. "Just a reprimand." Morales nodded approvingly. "Worth it though, right? To let your wife know you're okay?" Thomas smiled for the first time in days. Absolutely worth it. That night, as Thomas composed a letter to Margaret, detailing his rescue and recovery, he found himself thinking about the remarkable connection they had briefly established across thousands of miles of ocean. In his technical training, he had learned about the physics of radio wave propagation, about ionospheric reflection and signal skip. But none of that scientific knowledge could fully explain the miracle of hearing Margaret's voice at the exact moment when she happened to be at his radio. Some might call it coincidence, others fate. Thomas Sullivan, a rational man of science and technology, found himself considering a third possibility: that some connections transcend physical limitations, that the bond between two people can somehow bend the rules of the universe when it matters most. As April turned to May, Margaret established a new routine. Every Tuesday, she met with Commander Hayes to receive updates on Thomas's condition. Though the information was often minimal and days old, each confirmation that he was recovering well sustained her through the long weeks of separation. "His doctors report that the infection in his leg has cleared," Hayes informed her during their 4th meeting. "He's begun physical therapy and is expected to make a full recovery." Margaret studied the brief medical report, hungry for details. "Does it say anything about when he might be transported home?" Hayes shook his head. "I'm afraid not. The situation around Okinawa remains complicated. The island itself is still an active combat zone, and transport resources are prioritized accordingly. What Commander Hayes tactfully didn't mention were the reports crossing his desk about the increasingly desperate measures being employed by enemy forces around Okinawa, aircraft deliberately crashing into American vessels, causing devastating damage and casualties. The USS Colquhoun had been one of the first ships to face such attacks, but not the last. Throughout Boston, the mood was shifting as news from Europe brought hope of an end to the conflict there. On May 8th, Margaret joined thousands of her fellow citizens in celebrating Victory in Europe Day. Standing in Boston Common amid the cheering crowds, she felt a complex mix of emotions: joy for those whose loved ones would soon return from the European theatre, but anxiety for Thomas, still facing an uncertain journey home from the Pacific. "They say the Pacific could go on for another year or more," remarked Eleanor as they walked home from the celebrations. "But surely they'll rotate the wounded men home before that." "I hope so," Margaret replied, clutching her handbag where she kept Thomas's most recent official letter. A brief, carefully worded note that had passed through military censors. Unlike their miraculous radio conversation, his written words felt distant and formal, constrained by regulations and the knowledge that others would read them before she did. At Karamaretto, Thomas Sullivan's recovery progressed steadily through May and into June. As his strength returned, he was assigned light duties in the hospital's communications office, helping to coordinate radio traffic between the medical facility and the ships offshore. "You're wasted sorting message traffic, Sullivan," commented Commander Lewis Parker, the communications officer who had taken Thomas under his wing. "With your technical background, you should be doing something more substantial." Thomas shrugged, organizing a stack of transmission logs. "I'm grateful for any duty while I'm waiting for transport home." Parker studied him thoughtfully. "How's that leg coming along?" "Better every day," Thomas replied, though the injury still pained him after standing for long periods. "Doctors say I'll always have a limp, but I'll keep full mobility." Parker nodded, coming to a decision. "I'm putting you on the technical team. We're having issues with signal interference on some of the emergency frequencies. Your experience might help us solve the problem." The new assignment proved to be exactly what Thomas needed. A challenging technical puzzle that engaged his mind and distracted him from the frustration of being stranded thousands of miles from home while the war continued around him. Working with a team of radio technicians, Thomas discovered that some of their communication difficulties stemmed from an unexpected source. The increased number of radar systems operating in the area was creating electronic interference with certain radio frequencies. "It's a form of unintentional jamming," he explained during a briefing with Parker and the medical facility's commanding officer. "Our own radar systems are affecting our ability to communicate clearly on these bands." "Can it be fixed?" Parker asked. "We can reallocate the emergency channels to frequencies less susceptible to the interference," Thomas replied. "It requires reconfiguring a significant number of radio sets, but it's doable." His solution earned him commendation from the base commander and, more significantly, a recommendation for priority transport back to the United States once his medical clearance came through. "Your technical contribution has likely saved lives," Captain Jennings told him. "Clear communication during medical evacuations is essential. I've requested your transport on the next available hospital ship heading for San Francisco." In Boston, as spring gave way to summer, Margaret continued her work at the Navy Yard while waiting for news of Thomas's return. The amateur radio set remained silent in their spare room, a reminder of their extraordinary connection and the technological marvel that had briefly bridged the vast distance between them. On the morning of June 15th, Margaret was sorting through requisition forms when Commander Hayes appeared at her desk, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Sullivan, could you come with me, please?" Margaret's heart raced as she followed him to his office, fearing bad news. Once inside, Hayes closed the door and turned to her with an unexpected smile. "I've just received word from Pacific Fleet Headquarters. Lieutenant Sullivan has been cleared for transport and will be aboard the hospital ship USS Sanctuary, departing Karamaretto tomorrow." Margaret steadied herself against the edge of Hayes's desk. "He's coming home," she whispered, hardly daring to believe it. "He'll arrive in San Francisco in approximately 2 weeks, depending on weather and operational conditions. From there, he'll be transported to the Naval Hospital in Chelsea for final evaluation and release." 2 more weeks, Margaret repeated, joy and impatience warring within her. After months of uncertainty, 2 weeks seemed simultaneously an eternity, and no time at all. Commander Hayes reached into his desk drawer. "There's something else. I took the liberty of securing train tickets to San Francisco for you. The Navy doesn't typically arrange for families to meet returning personnel on the West Coast, but given the exceptional circumstances." Margaret accepted the envelope containing the tickets, momentarily speechless with gratitude. "Commander Hayes, I don't know how to thank you." "No thanks necessary," Hayes replied with a warm smile. Lieutenant Sullivan was one of my most promising students at the academy. Consider this my way of welcoming him home properly. That evening, Margaret sat at her kitchen table with Eleanor, planning her journey west. "You'll need new clothes," Eleanor insisted, making notes on a pad of paper. "Something special for when you first see him." Margaret laughed, a free, unburdened sound that she hadn't experienced in months. "I doubt Thomas will care what I'm wearing after all this time apart." "It's not for him, dear," Eleanor replied sagely. "It's for you, for your confidence. This is a moment you'll remember for the rest of your life." As the women planned, the radio on the sideboard broadcast the evening news, including reports of the intense fighting continuing on Okinawa. Margaret found herself listening with new attention, knowing that Thomas would soon be safely away from that dangerous region. "They say it could be the last major campaign of the war," Eleanor commented, gesturing toward the radio. "Though they've been saying that for months." "All that matters to me is that Thomas is coming home," Margaret replied, looking down at the train tickets in her hand. "Whatever happens after that, we'll face it together." Aboard the hospital ship USS Sanctuary, Thomas Sullivan stood at the railing, watching as the medical facility at Karama Retto grew smaller in the distance. Around him, hundreds of other injured servicemen occupied every available space on the converted luxury liner, men in various stages of recovery, all bound for American soil after months or years in the Pacific Theater. "Quite a sight, isn't it?" remarked a voice beside him. Thomas turned to find Dr. Freeman, the physician who had treated him upon his rescue. "The island?" Thomas asked, glancing back at the diminishing shoreline. "No," Freeman replied, gesturing at the crowded deck. "All these men going home. Some of them have been out here since 41, 4 years away from everything familiar." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "I've been fortunate. My tour was shorter than most. And luckier than most," Freeman added. "Not many men get pulled from the water after 4 days adrift." The ship's movement aggravated Thomas's injured leg, and he shifted his weight to ease the discomfort. Freeman noticed the grimace. "Still bothering you? The medical facilities aboard are excellent if you need attention." Thomas shook his head. "It's manageable. I'm saving my complaints for the hospital in Chelsea. The sooner they sign off on my recovery, the sooner I can truly go home." As the Sanctuary made its way eastward through the Philippine Sea, Thomas found himself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought him to this moment. The destruction of his ship, the days adrift, the rescue, the unsanctioned radio communication with Margaret, each link in a chain of improbable events leading toward reunion. The voyage to San Francisco took 12 days, slowed by the need to zigzag to avoid potential enemy submarines and by stops at Guam and Hawaii to offload critical patients and take on supplies. Throughout the journey, Thomas divided his time between physical therapy sessions to strengthen his injured leg and volunteering in the ship's communications room. On the evening before their scheduled arrival in San Francisco, Thomas found a quiet corner of the deck to compose a letter to Margaret, one that, unlike his previous correspondence, wouldn't pass through military censors. "My dearest Margaret," he wrote, "by the time you receive this, I'll be on American soil again. The thought of seeing your face, of holding you in my arms after these long months, sustains me through each hour of this journey. Our brief radio contact seems like a dream now, a miracle that defies logical explanation. Yet it happened, and in that moment, across thousands of miles, I felt closer to you than I had since leaving Boston." He continued writing as the sun set over the Pacific, pouring out the thoughts and feelings that had been constrained by distance, circumstance, and military regulations. The letter ran to several pages, far longer than any he had been able to send during his deployment. When he finally signed his name at the bottom, Thomas realized that Margaret might never read these words. According to his last update from Commander Hayes, she was planning to meet him in San Francisco, an unexpected joy that made the letter in his hands potentially unnecessary. Nevertheless, he folded the pages carefully and placed them in his pocket. Some sentiments were worth preserving, even if only for himself. In San Francisco, Margaret Sullivan arrived 2 days before the Sanctuary was due to dock. She checked into the Hotel Whitcomb on Market Street, recommended by Commander Hayes as comfortable and conveniently located. After settling in, she ventured out to explore the city that would serve as the backdrop for her reunion with Thomas. San Francisco pulsed with energy, its streets filled with servicemen on leave and civilians going about their business against the backdrop of a nation still at war. Margaret found herself watching the faces of passing naval officers, irrationally hoping to spot Thomas among them, despite knowing he was still at sea. On the morning the sanctuary was scheduled to arrive, Margaret rose before dawn, too anxious to sleep. She dressed carefully in a new blue dress that Eleanor had helped her select. "To match your eyes," Eleanor had insisted, and a matching hat with a small veil. The Port of San Francisco had established procedures for receiving hospital ships, with designated areas for family members to wait as patients were processed through medical evaluations. Margaret found herself among dozens of other wives, parents and children, all straining for the first glimpse of the white ship with its distinctive red crosses. "Is your husband aboard?" asked a woman standing next to Margaret, a young mother with a toddler balanced on her hip. "Yes," Margaret replied, unable to keep the smile from her face. "Lieutenant Thomas Sullivan, communications officer." "Mine too. He's aboard." "Sergeant James Whitley, Marines," the woman replied. "I'm Helen, this is Jimmy Jr." The child regarded Margaret solemnly, thumb firmly in his mouth. "He was born after James deployed," Helen explained. "They've never met in person." Margaret's heart swelled with empathy. "That must have been so difficult for you both." "Worth every minute," Helen replied with determination. "And now they'll finally meet." Their conversation was interrupted by an announcement over the loudspeakers. "Attention, please. The USS Sanctuary has entered the bay and will dock in approximately 45 minutes. Family members are asked to remain in the designated waiting areas." A collective murmur of excitement passed through the crowd as people strained to see past the warehouse buildings that partially blocked their view of the bay. Margaret found herself holding her breath, her hand unconsciously clutching the small locket around her neck. A gift from Thomas before he deployed, containing their wedding photograph in miniature. The minutes crawled by with excruciating slowness. Officials moved through the waiting area, checking identification and providing information about the disembarkation process. Medical cases will be evaluated and either transferred to local hospitals or cleared for immediate release, explained a Navy lieutenant to the assembled families. "Those cleared for release will be processed through this building here. We ask for your patience as this may take several hours." Several hours. After months of separation, even this short additional delay seemed unbearable to Margaret. She found herself pacing the small area, unable to remain still as anticipation built within her. Finally, the massive white hospital ship came into view, slowly maneuvering toward the dock with the assistance of tugboats. A cheer went up from the waiting families at the sight of the vessel that carried their loved ones back to them. Aboard the Sanctuary, Thomas stood at the railing, scanning the crowd gathered at the dock. From this distance, individual faces were indistinguishable, but knowing Margaret was among those waiting sent a surge of emotion through him that was almost physical in its intensity. Around him, other ambulatory patients crowded the decks, eager for their first glimpse of home after long deployments. The atmosphere was one of barely contained joy, tempered only by the presence of those too severely injured to join the celebration, men confined to the wards below decks, who would be transferred directly to hospitals for continued treatment. As the ship docked and the gangways were secured, the ship's captain made an announcement. "Gentlemen, welcome home. Disembarkation will begin with critical cases, followed by those requiring further hospitalization. Ambulatory patients cleared for immediate release will be processed last. Please report to your assigned stations as announced." The organized chaos of disembarkation began, with medical personnel coordinating the movement of stretchers and wheelchairs down the gangways to waiting ambulances. Thomas, classified as ambulatory despite his lingering limp, was directed to wait with a group of officers in the ship's mess hall until their turn came. "Sullivan," called the processing officer after what seemed an eternity. "Report to Medical Evaluation Station 3. Thomas made his way to the designated area, where a medical officer reviewed his chart and conducted a brief examination of his healing leg wound. "Any pain during normal activities?" the doctor asked, probing the scar tissue. "Some discomfort after standing for long periods," Thomas admitted. but it's improving daily. The doctor made several notes in Thomas's file. You're cleared for immediate release. You'll need to report to your assigned facility. He checked the paperwork. Chelsea Naval Hospital within 30 days for follow-up evaluation. Until then, you're on medical leave. With that, Thomas was directed through a series of administrative checkpoints where his identification was verified, his pay was updated, and he was issued temporary travel vouchers. The process was frustratingly slow, but Thomas understood its necessity. Hundreds of men were being processed simultaneously, each with unique circumstances and destinations. Finally, over 3 hours after the ship had docked, Thomas emerged from the processing center into the bright California sunshine, immediately scanning the crowd of waiting families for Margaret's face. The waiting area had thinned somewhat, as other reunions had already taken place, but dozens still remained, watching eagerly as each serviceman appeared. Thomas moved forward, searching, his heart pounding with anticipation. And then, suddenly, she was there. Margaret stood apart from a small group, her blue dress vivid against the drab surroundings, her face upturned and searching just as intently as his own. For a moment, they simply stared at one another across the distance, as if neither could quite believe the reality of the other's presence. Thomas moved first, his injured leg forgotten as he strode toward her with increasing speed. Margaret broke into a run, heedless of decorum or the curious glances of those around them. They met in the middle of the waiting area, colliding in an embrace so tight that Thomas momentarily lost his balance, steadying himself against her as her arms encircled his waist. "Thomas," Margaret whispered against his neck, her voice breaking on his name. "You're really here." "I'm here," he confirmed, pulling back just enough to look into her eyes, to confirm that this was not another hallucination born of desperation, like those he had experienced on the raft. "I made it back to you." Around them, other reunions unfolded, wives embracing husbands, children meeting fathers for the first time, parents welcoming sons home. Each story unique yet part of the greater tapestry of a nation still at war, celebrating individual victories while the larger conflict continued. For Thomas and Margaret, the public nature of their reunion soon gave way to a desire for privacy. Hand in hand, they made their way from the port to the Hotel Whitcomb, stopping only to send telegrams to Eleanor and Commander Hayes confirming Thomas's safe arrival. In their hotel room, away from the eyes of strangers, they began the delicate process of reacquainting themselves with one another, not just physically, but emotionally and intellectually, sharing the experiences that had shaped them during their separation. "Show me," Margaret said softly, gesturing to his injured leg. Thomas hesitated briefly before rolling up his trouser leg to reveal the angry red scar that ran from his knee, halfway down his calf. Margaret knelt beside him, her fingers hovering just above the damaged skin without touching it. "Does it hurt very much?" "Less every day," he assured her. "The doctors say I was fortunate. No nerve damage, no loss of function. Just a reminder of how close I came to not making it home." Margaret stood and wrapped her arms around him again, as if reassuring herself of his solidity. "When I received that telegram, it was like the world ended. And then, hearing your voice on the radio, I still can't believe the connection held long enough for us to speak," Thomas marveled, leading her to sit beside him on the edge of the bed. "The technical probability of that signal reaching Boston, of you being at the radio at that exact moment, it defies calculation." "Maybe some things aren't meant to be calculated," Margaret suggested, resting her head against his shoulder. "Maybe some connections transcend mathematics and probability." Thomas smiled, remembering his own similar thoughts during his recovery on Karama Reto. "The scientist in me wants to analyze it, to break it down into wave propagation and atmospheric conditions. But the man in me," he turned to face her, cupping her cheek in his palm, "the man in me just wants to be grateful for whatever forces brought us back together." Over the following days, as they waited for their train back to Boston, Thomas and Margaret explored San Francisco together, not as tourists, but as two people rediscovering the simple pleasure of being in one another's company. They walked the hilly streets hand in hand, dined in small restaurants, and watched the fog roll in from the bay in the evenings. On their final night in the city, They sat in a small park overlooking the water, discussing their future. "Hayes mentioned there might be a teaching position for me at the academy," Thomas said, watching the lights of boats moving across the darkening bay. "Given my leg, active service might be limited." "Would you be happy teaching?" Margaret asked, studying his profile in the fading light. Thomas considered the question seriously. "I think I would. Sharing what I've learned about communications, preparing the next generation, there's value in that." "And we could stay in Boston," Margaret added, the relief evident in her voice. "No more deployments, no more separations." Thomas turned to face her. "No more separations," he agreed, taking her hand. "I've had enough distance between us to last a lifetime." As they boarded the eastbound train the following morning, Thomas carried with him not only the physical reminders of his ordeal, his healing wound, his service records, the few possessions salvaged from his time in the Pacific, but also a profound appreciation for the technology that had allowed him to reach across impossible distances to reconnect with Margaret when it mattered most. Their journey home took them across the vast American landscape, through the mountains and deserts of the West, across the plains of the Midwest, and finally into the familiar territory of the eastern seaboard. Throughout the trip, Thomas found himself drawn to the radio equipment installed in their Pullman car, explaining to Margaret the technical aspects of the communications systems that connected the moving train to stations along the route. "It's similar in principle to what we were using in the Pacific," he told her, though obviously with different power levels and frequency allocations. Margaret smiled at his enthusiasm. "You've missed this, haven't you? The technical work." "I have," Thomas admitted. "There's something deeply satisfying about solving problems through applied science, about making connections where none existed before." As their train pulled into Boston's South Station on a sunny July morning, Thomas and Margaret Sullivan stepped onto the platform to find Eleanor waiting for them, waving excitedly. "Welcome home!" she called, embracing them both. "The whole neighborhood's been waiting to hear of your arrival." "No welcome committee, I hope," Margaret said, knowing Thomas would prefer a quiet return. "Nothing formal," Eleanor assured them, "though I can't promise people won't stop by once word gets out that you're back." Thomas smiled, his arm around Margaret's waist. "I suppose that's a small price to pay for coming home to such a supportive community." In the taxi ride to their Marlborough Street home, Thomas gazed out at the familiar Boston landmarks with new appreciation. After the tropical heat of the Pacific, the moderate New England summer felt refreshing. The architectural landscape of brick and brownstone, a welcome contrast to the makeshift military installations and field hospitals that had been his surroundings for so long. "Commander Hayes sends his regrets that he couldn't meet you personally," Eleanor informed them. "He's been temporarily reassigned to Washington, but expects to return next month." "We'll have plenty of time to thank him properly," Margaret replied, squeezing Thomas's hand. "Thanks to his arrangements, we had those extra days together in San Francisco." As they arrived at their home, Thomas paused on the sidewalk, looking up at the familiar facade. "It looks exactly as I remembered it," he said softly. "I haven't changed a thing," Margaret assured him, unlocking the front door. "I wanted everything to be just as you left it." Inside, Thomas moved slowly from room to room, reacquainting himself with the spaces they had shared before his deployment. When he reached the spare room that housed his amateur radio equipment, he stopped in the doorway, a wave of emotion washing over him. "This is where you were," he said, turning to Margaret, who had followed him. "When my signal reached you." She nodded, stepping past him into the room. "I started coming in here every evening after you disappeared, just to feel close to you. I never actually expected." She trailed off, running her fingers over the dials of the radio set. Thomas joined her, examining the equipment. "It's an extraordinary piece of technology, isn't it? Something designed simply to transmit voice and code across distance, but capable of so much more, of maintaining connections, preserving relationships, even saving lives." In the months and years that followed, as the war in the Pacific finally came to its conclusion and the nation began its transition to peacetime, Thomas Sullivan did indeed take up the teaching position at the Naval Academy, specializing in advanced communications systems. His experiences during the conflict, particularly his miraculous connection with Margaret across thousands of miles of ocean, became part of his curriculum, a powerful illustration of both the technical capabilities and human significance of the communications networks that increasingly connected the modern world. For Margaret, the memory of that evening in April, of hearing Thomas's voice emerge from the static when she had believed him lost forever, remained the defining moment of her life, a personal miracle amid the global upheaval of war. In later years, when their children and eventually their grandchildren asked about the small amateur radio set that maintained a place of honor in their home long after more modern communications technologies had superseded it, Margaret would tell them the story of how a single transmission had bridged an impossible distance, defied overwhelming odds, and reunited two people who thought they had lost each other forever. In a world increasingly connected by technology, their story served as a reminder that behind every signal, every transmission, every technological marvel, lay the fundamentally human desire to reach out across distance, to connect, to communicate, to come home. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.